Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast associated with Texas+Water, which is a publication of the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University, the Texas Water Journal, and the Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M University. My name is Todd Votteler. I'm the editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas Water Journal, and I'm very happy to welcome today to the seventh podcast my guest, Lara Fowler, who is an attorney and mediator, as well as a professor at Penn State University in the law school and the Institutes of Energy and Environment. And she has been working on questions related to water for a while now, and she's going to start off by hopefully telling us a little bit about the work that she's been doing. Welcome, Lara. It's good to talk to you this morning.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me on board.
So tell us a little bit about the things that you've done in water. I know that you have been at Penn State for a while, but you were in Oregon working for a number of years there before you went into the academic arena.
Yeah. I actually got my start really working in water growing up in southern Idaho, and we spent a lot of time messing about in boats. We moved to Oregon when I was in middle school, and when I was in high school, I actually had to write a history paper and wrote a history paper of the history of California water challenges, which was eye-opening for several reasons. One, which is how not to write a paper that big, but two, just the width and depth of the number of challenges associated with California and water questions. I went to college in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College and created a de facto degree in water resource management. And as an undergrad, actually went to a conference on Native American water rights and met an attorney, Jim Noteboom, who represented the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation of Oregon. Who basically said, look, if you're from Oregon, why don't you look at what's in your own backyard? I'm representing the Confederated Tribes as they're negotiating with the state of Oregon and the federal government for their water rights. And so as a student, I actually pursued research in that area and was able to attend a number of the negotiation sessions. Because I didn't represent anybody, I was able to engage with people from all perspectives and get a better understanding of what was happening with that negotiation. So while my official undergrad degree is Japanese, my unofficial degree was water resource management. I graduated from college and I moved back to Oregon. I worked a series of bad jobs for a year while I was a competitive cross-country ski racer, and then hung up my skis and started working just for a little bit for the Oregon Water Resources Commission, a lobby group representing irrigation districts. Funding ran out for that job, and so I switched working to the state of Oregon, the Oregon Water Resources Department. And while working at the Oregon Water Resources Department, I was based in the state capital of Salem, Oregon, but a field liaison, senior field liaison to first the eastern third of the state, and then the south central portion of the state, and working on questions of water conservation, both for agricultural purposes and municipal conservation, but also in-stream flow restoration. I was given the task of working with a number of communities that were really struggling to figure out how to address water supplies in their areas and what that might look like. And then when I switched to the south central portion of the state, that included the Klamath Basin and the Deschutes Basin. So I served as the note taker for a number of the discussions in the Klamath Basin in the late 1990s, where we would go down and have big sessions with 60, 70, 80, 90 people trying to figure out how to proceed in a basin where not enough water existed for the number of competing demands and uses. The last project I worked on was in the Deschutes Basin of Oregon, where I was a staff person helping staff a stakeholder group between four state agencies and multiple interests to try and sort out how to address water supplies in the Deschutes River Basin, where surface water had been overallocated since the 1920s. And the U.S. Geological Survey had done a study in the 90s basically indicating that surface and groundwater were hydraulically connected, and any further withdrawals from groundwater would impact surface water rights. And so at the time it was one of the fastest set of growing counties in the country, and there was effectively a moratorium on any further water development. That actually piqued my interest in working on water conflict, in part as a mediator, a neutral third party to help people come together. And so I went to law school with the idea of not being a lawyer per se, but of being a mediator and doing dispute resolution associated with water. So we moved actually to Seattle, Washington, where we went back to school. I was working on my law degree at the same time my husband was working on his PhD in geography. And so while I was in law school, I was able to actually focus on negotiation and mediation training with the idea, again, of doing mediation in the water world. I graduated and had the good fortune to be able to start working with a law firm, a medium-sized law firm based out of Tacoma, Washington, Gordon Thomas Honeywell, LLP. They also had a Seattle office, and so I was in their Seattle office. But working a lot with my colleague, Jim Waldo, who's done a lot of work in California on water issues, again, primarily as a mediator. And so had the good fortune of working on pretty critical issues of water quality in the San Joaquin Valley of California, who is entitled to use and store groundwater in the Los Angeles area, in the Central and West Coast groundwater basins. We also worked with state water contractors dealing with a contract provision called the Area of Origin provision that pitted Northern California water contractors against Southern California water contractors. And again, the privilege of working as a mediator, a neutral third party in those pretty challenging questions to help people thread the needle on questions that really affected science, law, policy, politics, and economics, and how do you actually move forward to get things done. I also did mediation work in Oregon and Washington. For example, served as a facilitator for the Chehalis Basin River Flood Authority, whose job was to try and figure out how to address 100 years worth of flooding and a pattern of increasingly catastrophic floods in the Chehalis Basin of Washington state. We moved to State College, Pennsylvania, Penn State, in 2012. So I've been here since then, working both at the law school, Penn State Law, as well as the Penn State Institutes of Energy and Environment on questions of water, energy, and dispute resolution.
Wow, well, you've done pretty much everything that you could do in terms of water disputes along the West Coast. I'm just curious, what do you see now that you are at Penn State? What do you see in terms of the differences between what's happening in the Western United States with regard to water and what's happening in the Eastern United States?
I think that's a great question, and one of the things that struck me most about being both a Western water lawyer and a mediator who's worked so much on the West Coast and then to move to the East Coast is to realize, everybody here in the East Coast is like, oh, we've got water quality questions, for example, and I'll speak later about the Chesapeake Bay, but we also have water quantity questions. And so when I'm talking with a lot of my Western colleagues, laughingly say the wild, wild West is not the West, it's actually the East, where a lot of times we really don't have a good handle in the Eastern U.S. on who is using what water and how much what has been promised. A number of Eastern states have registration laws, for example, if you're using above a certain amount of water, but we really have no good handle on how much water people are using. There's a tremendous amount of unpermitted wells. Pennsylvania, for example, actually has no well drilling standard. Thought you could move to Pennsylvania and drill a well in many parts of the state and you'd be qualified to do so. And so it's been a real eye-opener, I think, to move to the East Coast and to look around and realize the question of water scarcity, of drought, is actually a pretty critical question. Right now, it's not. It's pretty wet, pretty soggy in a big chunk of the eastern U.S. But 2016, if you look, for example, at the Gray satellites, or if you look at the level of drought up and down, it wasn't the west coast of the U.S. that was showing up as drought. It was the east.
So what about, kind of the West as being the example for people in the Eastern United States? I mean, it seems like, the institutions that have evolved in the Western United States to handle water scarcity, might provide examples for the Eastern United States in some ways. In other ways, they're probably not applicable, but the expertise is certainly there. I'm, curious do you see a lot of folks who are practitioners in the Western United States now kind of focusing on the needs of the Eastern United States?
There are a handful. I think someone like a Matt Draper, who's out of New York City, his dad is in practice also in New Mexico, that they have really that East Coast, West Coast practice. There are a handful of Eastern water lawyers scattered up and down the East Coast, but the legal bar of people who practice water law in the East is pretty limited. And I teach water law at Penn State Law, and there are a number of people, again, who teach water law in the Eastern U.S., but not that many, compared to almost a mandatory course in most Western law schools.
What about the model of the institutions themselves? Do some of the eastern states look at what's been done, for example, in Oregon, where you were working for a number of years, and say, hey, some of what they were doing there is probably a pretty good model for us in the future?
Oregon, for example, dealt with water quantity through the Oregon Water Resources Department and water quality through the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Washington State had just one organization, the Washington Department of Ecology. I think what you see is in the East, institutions like state agencies in Pennsylvania, the Department of Environmental Protection, that deals a little bit with some aspects of water quantity, a lot more with water quality. Virginia, for example, also has a Department of Environmental Quality that has recently been dealing with saltwater intrusion along the coast of Virginia. They actually worked for about 10 years with 10 of their biggest pumpers to decrease the amount of water they were taking to deal with that saltwater intrusion problem. They figured that deal out and kind of worked out the details of it last year or so. So you're starting to see an evolution of institutions to expand into the water quantity space. The other thing that we have a lot more of in the eastern U.S. is interstate watershed commissions. So here in Pennsylvania, we may be the queen of having the most of them, and some of the oldest. Delaware River Basin Watershed Commission was put in place in the 1960s, in part to one of the earliest lawsuits of states fighting over quantity and quality in the Delaware River Basin. We also have the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. A huge amount of the water flowing into the Chesapeake Bay, more than 50%, comes from the Susquehanna River, and most of that is in Pennsylvania. And so what you have is an interesting overlay of state jurisdiction. So, for example, both Pennsylvania and New York have a registration system, and a federal overlay through the state watershed commissions. So, for example, as hydraulic fracturing came on the scene in Pennsylvania, you have the Susquehanna River Basin Commission looking at it saying, this has a potential impact on water supplies, water quantity, particularly in smaller headwater streams. We're going to start regulating that. And so for where there had been a bar for bigger water users, 30,000 gallons of water per day over a 30-day moving average, with hydraulic fracturing, they basically said, we don't know what the impacts are going to be. We're going to start from any amount of water taken. We will actually regulate and require a permit. So again, you have actually a kind of dual system of both state and then federal or regional bodies helping oversee that.
And certainly that work that you just mentioned with the commissions is probably related to work that you've done with the Chesapeake. Why don't you tell us about the Chesapeake Bay work?
Sure. So the Chesapeake Bay is one of the largest estuaries in the United States and in the world. A friend and colleague who does the Chesapeake Bay program basically says, look, if you took a piece of paper and you put it flat out, the Chesapeake Bay is as deep in comparison with that paper as it is wide, just to have a visual of how shallow it is. Again, a lot of the freshwater inflow, I think a lot of the focus has been how do we restore the bay, and have been from the 1960s and the 1970s. About a decade or a little bit more than that ago, the focus went from how do we restore the estuary, the actual area where the salt water and freshwater sources, wastewater treatment plants and other things like that. And certainly just this week, actually, a new Bay Barometer came out indicating that a lot of the efforts are making good progress. However, what you're also seeing is a huge increase in stormwater runoff and impacts in non-point sources, both from agricultural and municipal stormwater. And that's an area where, as that, you got a storm that drops multiple inches of rain in a handful of hours, will flush a lot of nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment down into the bay. This past year was incredibly wet and very rainy, as much as the west was dry in parts. The east had water storms just stuck for weeks at a time, and that flushed a lot of nutrients down into the bay. So people are looking at that to see what the impact is. I am on the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, wearing, if you will, a social science impact or social science hat from that, given the amount of work I've done with stakeholder engagement. And so it's been really interesting to both be understanding what Pennsylvania's perspective is, but also engaging at the Bay program level to hear what's happening across the whole Bay program.
So you mentioned land use practices are now becoming a focus. My impression had been, and I was probably incorrect about this, that that those practices had been a focus for a couple of decades now, and so there's now, I guess, a greater effort on the regulatory side with regard to non-point source land use practices.
There is, yeah, and how to really address, again, this isn't just a Chesapeake Bay question, this is a global question. We've been working on a proposal with folks and colleagues at the University of Sheffield in England, also reaching out to folks within the Baltic, how to handle what is happening on the land and how that then affects water are really, really big questions worldwide. These are global questions, and partly it's a nutrient imbalance question, where if you think of the analogy, if you give a kid too much sugar, they got to run around and are bonkers for a while. Nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, are a lot like sugar for algae, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you have a lot of that flush off into a system where the microorganisms basically take it up and bloom and then die, and as they die and break down, it creates the hypoxic conditions within the estuaries. That's what's leading to it. It's off the coast of Florida, it's off, again, in the Baltic, it's in the Chesapeake Bay. And so part of it is, how do we keep the nutrients where we need them to grow crops? Something like phosphorus is actually a valuable mineral that people mine. Most of it right now comes from Morocco, for example. How do we keep it where we need it and not where we don't want it, where we're creating these incredible nutrient-saturated zones that, again, create toxic algae blooms? Lake Erie certainly had, at the city of Toledo, lost their water supply for quite a bit of time at a huge cost and expense a couple of years ago. Each year they're really looking at that harmful algal bloom and trying to figure out how to decrease it. It's a global question that's playing out in the Chesapeake, and a lot of those questions are land use questions. If you look at the monitoring data, it indicates that things are going in the right direction for the Chesapeake Bay, which is great news. Are we there yet? No. And part of the challenge is the practices we're putting on the ground take some time to have an effect. People are looking again at the changing conditions we're seeing on the ground to say, hey, is this past, is the summer into the fall of 2018 emblematic of our new normal for incredible precipitation in the East Coast? We also had, in the midst of that incredible precipitation, a couple periods of drought. Caught my attention is last week here in Pennsylvania, we actually had a fire watch. So we went from flood warning to fire watch in pretty quick order. And so we're seeing also periods of dryness interspersed with this amazing amount of precipitation. And trying to manage systems for both of those things is actually a pretty significant challenge.
Yeah, that's kind of a snapshot of living in Texas. You're going from a drought to a flood and back all the time. So,
and part of it then becomes, well, how do you manage, for example, increased growth and development and the potential increase for impervious surface, which can lead to more flood?
Right.
How do you restore and protect potential aquifer recharge areas? How do you manage climate change? Again, one of the big questions for the Chesapeake Bay is are the impacts, for example, on climate change? If you plant a streamside buffer and suddenly you're seeing a lot higher intensity of precipitation, can that buffer withstand it? Does it do the job it was meant to do for water quality purposes? How do we create more resilient best management practices to withstand what we expect from climate change? And so the Bay program, for example, is coming up with lists of scientific questions that it really is considering, and climate change-related questions are in the top of those scientific needs of what they're pondering.
Just a question about some of the solutions there. Somebody who worked for land trusts for a number of years, are land trusts engaged in that process with regard to the Chesapeake, or are land trusts working to try to preserve riparian areas and work with landowners to improve their land use practices?
Yes, and we have, you name it, we've got people involved with the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is a part of 6 states plus Washington, D.C. You have very, very local entities to really big entities and everything in between. Local land trusts, for example, here in the area that I'm living in, the Center County Farmland Preservation Trust is working to keep farms active and productive, but also protect sort of open space. The questions of land use there's 3 big questions the Chesapeake Bay is working, trying to figure out. Well, wait a second. We set targets for reductions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and total solids for the Bay. There was a midpoint assessment in the year 2017 with the goal that all these practices are in place by 2025, and we're starting then to see over time, because the impact, the benefits of such practices, again, installing buffers, planting cover crops, a whole range of things will take some time to see. So we're aiming towards a 2025 goal in reduction of phosphorus, nitrogen, and total dissolved solids. But the concern is those goals may be exacerbated by changes in land use, changes in climate, and then a third confounding factor that the states collectively are working to try and figure out is how to handle dams on the Susquehanna River that are effectively dynamically full of sediment behind them. So the poster child for that is the Conowingo Dam, which is the lowermost dam on the Susquehanna River. And so that's not an issue that's isolated to just the Chesapeake Bay, which is there have been more runoff of sediment and more buildup of sediment behind dams across the whole U.S. and in fact globally. It ranges from where you are, but how to handle that sediment that is launched behind a dam is a huge question. It's not only a huge scientific question, but also a political and economic question.
And it seems like the movement to remove dams that are no longer serving their original function, that a lot of that movement is seeing success in that part of the world. And so I'm curious about that. Is that integrated into the efforts to improve the Chesapeake, or is that just kind of something that's going on more or less independent from that effort?
It's both independent and tied in. One of the big questions is legacy sediment. My husband's actually teaching an apocalyptic geography class and taking his students on a tour of an area that was one of the original, 100 years, 150 years ago, it was a town of 300 people, and today there's nothing there. But we went out over the weekend to just kind of check it out, and you can see the legacy impacts of, in that particular instance, they were creating, they were mining and creating charcoal and other aspects for this what led to the steel industry here. And so 100 years ago, there were no trees anywhere in Pennsylvania, right? Most of Pennsylvania was logged over. You had a number of small mill and check dams everywhere. And I think Pennsylvania actually, to my surprise, is leading the nation, or right up there in one of the top states in dam removal. And they tend to be the smaller check dams, the mill dams, in a lot of different areas. Partly I think it's because it's liability for landowners if somebody were to be hurt in an impoundment behind that huge active fishing and hunting community. And part of it restoration. Big dams like the Conowingo Dam on the Susquehanna produce hydroelectricity, and they're going through a FERC licensing renewal process. But what to do with that sediment has also come up in that process. So it is partially tied to, how do we restore our streams and deal with those questions of legacy sediment. But it's also, recreation and access, and I think private property questions as well.
There's not to spend too much time on this, but there's a lot of emotion surrounding the dam removal issue. I've always kind of been, interested in how there are a lot of people who look at, dam removals as a threat to projects which are functional and, flood control projects are doing what they're intended to do. And then, maybe some on the other side about removing dams like that may still be serving their original purpose. To me, it seems like, dams are tools and, they may outlive their usefulness. And at some point, they've got a useful life. And it's not something that we should really be afraid of thinking of it in that way. That once they outlive their usefulness, maybe be time to remove them.
Sure. Yeah, and if you look at, a lot of the dam removal projects that I've actually watched pretty closely, wasn't involved but watched on the Sandy River in Oregon, took a long time to negotiate and to figure out, but I think they looked at the cost of upgrading those facilities to allow for fish passage, and PGE, not PG&E, which is in California, but PGE, which is in Oregon, based out of Portland, did the analysis and basically said, hey, this isn't producing enough electricity to merit the cost it's going to take to upgrade it. It took a lot of work and a lot of collaboration. Julie Kyle, who's now passed away and deceased, but helped spearhead that in Oregon to remove those. That was one of the larger dam removal projects for a while. Now you've seen, for example, in the White Salmon River in Washington State, that dam has been removed, Condon Dam on the White Salmon, or the Elwha Dam on the Olympic Peninsula. Particularly, the Elwha Dam removal was a partnership of a lot of different people to figure out what to do with a dam that was illegally put in the first place in around 1914, and had a huge impact on the fish runs in the area, a huge impact on the tribal interests and local fisheries. As that dam has come out, the restoration, the natural ecosystem restoration in that area has been pretty phenomenal. There's great footage of people who have filmed and tracked that. And so if people are looking at the cooperative effort it has taken to figure out, well, how do we handle potentially obsolete facilities and restore the ecosystem? I think the results from some of those projects have actually been fairly astonishing for people.
So let's go ahead and move down south a little bit and talk about the litigation before the Supreme Court between Georgia and Florida, and that whole dispute between Georgia, Florida, and Alabama over the ACF basin. And so why don't you tell us, and you're going to have to start off with telling us what ACF stands for, because I always have a hard time getting it right. And then also talk a little bit about how the litigation at the Supreme Court may or may not really match the overall dispute.
Yeah, the ACF stands for the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint. And I think it's one of my favorite river basins to be able to say. But it's a river system that basically is in part in between and sometimes the boundary of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And so a lot of the legal disputes actually over the ACF system date back to 1989 or 1990, I think, when the first cases were filed by Alabama against the other two states. There's a whole series of cases that have been filed in different courts at different times alleging different things. So the most recent case, however, filed by Florida against Georgia, did not file against Alabama. It's just Florida versus Georgia. It was filed in early 2013 water law and allocation policies. I keep laughing every time I move to a new state. I have to take everything I know about water law, throw it out, and start over.
Right.
And I've had to do that for Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California, and now Pennsylvania and different states in the East. And so there's a different standard applied to water disputes between states. So there's a whole series. It's one of the places where there's original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court is actually acting as the trial court for a dispute between the states. And so what happened is, and basically the reason for that is the original writers of the Constitution basically said, we are not going to assume that a state is going to get a fair trial or fair hearing if they're being forced to come to another state. And so the Supreme Court, in acting like a trial court, can decide whether or not to take a case. There are about 10,000 cases requested to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in any given year. They take about 90. So your odds of having a Supreme Court case actually accepted for hearing, reviewed for certiorari, is what is called a reviewed for cert, is actually fairly small. But again, the disputes between states are one place that the court will take that. Does the Supreme Court sit and hear all the evidence of a big case like this? No, which is why they hire a special master, somebody whose job it is to basically oversee the case, and then they review the outcome and the determination of it. So in this particular instance in the ACF, again, the Appalachia-Chattahoochee-Flint system, Florida sued Georgia, saying in a time of drought, Georgia took more than its fair share of water under the doctrine of equitable apportionment. What's fair for allocation of water between those two states? Florida basically alleging that as Georgia took more than its fair share, it decreased the amount of water coming eventually out of the Apalachicola River into Apalachicola Bay, decreasing the salinity and impacting the oyster population of the Apalachicola Bay, where they had a crash in population. Georgia refuted that and said, look, this is really the Corps of Engineers is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the main player, dictating how water moves through the system, and it is not our mismanagement of water. It is, we're doing fine, and we're supporting a huge economy based on our water, both for farming and for municipal use. And you can't prove that we are the ones who caused the collapse in the oyster bay. Look to your own management.
So I have a basic question about that. When I read the filings a few years ago, my first reaction was I can't understand why Florida didn't sue the Corps initially, and I think a lot of people here have been kind of surprised by that. Do you have any insight on that?
It can be fairly difficult, actually, to sue aspects of the federal government. There are sorts of rules about who you can sue and cannot. Sovereign immunity is a big piece of it. Why they didn't include or attempt to include the Corps of Engineers in the original filing, I don't know.
So where is that litigation now? I know that the original special master, Ralph Lancaster, passed away recently, but he concluded his report and sent it to the Supreme Court, and they took a look at it.
Ralph Lancaster was appointed the special master, and he's an interesting person. This is his fourth case serving as a special master on very, very different topics. One other, I think, was a water case, but he was based out of Portland, Maine, and so he was overseeing the case. And you can go online. I think the docket has actually been moved to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and if you look up and just search Florida versus Georgia, you can actually find all of the filings, and I'll come back to why it's now within the 10th Circuit. But they assigned the case to Ralph Lancaster, who invited the parties to brief the case, took in a huge amount of evidence, and I think in the fall of 2016 had about a 6 or 8 week, can't remember the exact time frame, but a long multi-week trial of all the evidence in Portland, Maine. He issued his findings in early February 2017, basically saying that Florida, in its attempts to prove that Georgia had harmed it, couldn't make their finding because of the lack of involvement of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and what a pivotal role that they played. their review. Both sets of parties, as well as a couple other states, actually have filed briefing to the U.S. Supreme Court that was heard for oral argument very early in January of 2018. And for anybody in the water world, particularly non-lawyers, I actually really recommend listening to that hearing. You can find the transcript of it, but you can also hear the recording on a website called OYEZ, OYEZ.org, I believe. And what that really was the justices having a discussion about the Corps of Engineers models and their ability to know if you saved water and could send molecules of water through the system, would it actually make it down to the Apalachicola Bay portion of the overall watershed. They came back after a while. People were waiting for a very long time. Again, the oral arguments were in January of 2018. This decision from the court did not come down until the very last day, the very last decision that the court issued in June of 2018. They basically said, no, we think the standard was too strict as applied, and that, in fact, Florida did not have to prove its case by clear and convincing evidence. The court set out 6 questions that they wanted people to answer, Florida and Georgia to answer, and sent it back. They then, in August of 2018, actually reassigned not only this case, but another case, New Mexico and Texas, to reassign them from the special masters who had been hearing the cases to federal judges. So different special masters in both cases. Here, Senior U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Paul J. Kelly Jr. is from the 10th Circuit. He's based out of Santa Fe. Received assignment of this case. And at the time, I was kind of curious. I was like, what's the connection here?
Right.
And I still don't know this for sure, but actually, in kind of spelunking through a little bit, it looks like one of the associates at Ralph Lancaster's firm in Maine had clerked for Justice Kelly. Who knows? This is me speculating and trying to pull together the pieces of how this suddenly went from a special master in Maine to a special master who is a circuit court judge in the 10th Circuit. That may be one connection. But what was also interesting, again, is this was not the only case where a special master had been overseeing a case, was removed from the case, and the case reassigned to a federal judge. So I spent some time trying to ponder that, and it may be that there was a shift within the U.S. Supreme Court and how they wanted to approach cases in general. Not necessarily anything for or against this particular special master.
So I was curious about all that as well. Why it ended up with a judge out in New Mexico. What the connection was, and all that. But you mentioned Texas versus New Mexico. Both of those cases were heard on the same day at the Supreme Court, and we're not going to discuss that today, but we will in upcoming podcasts. But that was definitely a big day at the Supreme Court for water rights.
Yeah, and if you looked at both cases, interestingly enough, you have the U.S. government in one case and not in a different case, and both cases were kind of being argued almost oppositely, right? In one case, government was there as an indispensable party, and in a different case, it should have been there. So it's just interesting to juxtapose those two cases. The New Mexico and Texas litigation and the decision in that came out way earlier than the Florida versus Georgia case.
So the special master Lancaster essentially said that it's hard to be sure that if Georgia does something, it's going to be beneficial to Florida because the Corps is managing the reservoirs, and it may or may not be helpful. And
that was a big question because partly, the Corps of Engineers had provided some briefing in the case, basically saying, hey, we're going to pay attention to what the courts say. And again, in an interesting stroke of timing, the Corps of Engineers had been working through a new master water control manual for the ACF system that was actually issued released and adopted in February of 2017, very, very shortly after the Special Master, Ralph Lancaster, released his findings. And so what you had is the Supreme Court kind of trying to figure out, well, okay, does this new Master Water Control Manual, how does it fit in? Again, when the court issued 6 questions, it said, go back and figure this out again. Standard wasn't quite right, go take a look at this. So the parties, I think, pulled the pieces back together, and they've submitted supplemental pleadings and briefings this year, January 31st, 2019, and February 28th, 2019. On March 12th, Florida requested oral argument. Georgia apparently in the pleadings basically said, it's up to the Special Master what you want to do. So that's where things stand, is waiting. Again, briefing has been submitted. You can take a look at what's online. It's from the 10th Circuit. The whole docket is there under Special Master docket number 142.
So it's back in the hands of the new Special Master, who's the federal judge from New Mexico, and he may or may not have another hearing.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. Now, I was, curious. The other day, the Georgia Assembly voted to reopen discussions with Tennessee and North Carolina on whether the border between those states should be moved, which I think for the hopes of Georgia, they're hoping that would shift the border north so that part of the Tennessee River, just I guess a little bend of the river, would be in Georgia and give Georgia access to the water in the Tennessee River. I looked at that, and I kind of think, is that really a serious effort? Do they really believe that the other states would be willing to cede some territory? And has that happened before?
Yeah, so this kind of survey mistake is not unheard of. I mentioned earlier that I had looked closely at the negotiation of the Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs with the state of Oregon for their water rights in the federal government. And one of the hang-ups in that particular negotiation actually was a survey mistake made 150 years or something before, right? Where the surveyor said, the line goes from this point to this point, but somebody had made an error, and in that case it was an error of a tract of land of thousands of acres. So the early surveying, is there a potential for mistakes? Sure. Does this show up in lots of different circumstances? Sure. It is interesting in looking at it. Are the other states likely to say, yeah, sure, go ahead and take some of our territory? No. In looking at this question, which you gave me beforehand, Tennessee, for example, if the line is redrawn, this would impact some portion of the city of Chautauqua, for example. And so it's not exactly likely to go over, and certainly the newspaper accounts from Tennessee indicate that they're not, this does not give them warm and fuzzy feelings about the potential for losing a chunk of their territory. And one of the questions that often comes up, too, is over water allocation in general, is the state doing as much as it's supposed to actually reduce its demand? What's the water conservation, for example, that they're implementing and reducing their demand in other areas? Historically, a lot of the time, it was, hey, we need more water, we need to go somewhere else and get it. California is a good example of this. But as technology has changed, as norms and expectations have changed, it's no longer possible just to go get water from someplace else. You, in fact, need to live within the amount that's available in that local area or that had been previously developed. So I think you see this border dispute as, hey, maybe this is our silver bullet for providing more water for Georgia. I don't see it being an easy way forward, given the very, very likely resistance that you can already see actually in newspaper accounts about this from the other two states, Tennessee in particular.
Right. And on behalf of our many listeners in Chattanooga, where I have friends, I just want to say I think it's unlikely anything's going to happen with that. Texas has got kind of Texas and Mexico, and I guess California and Arizona, I guess, also there's a historical issue with regard to surveying the state. Not that, anything would ever happen with that. But I know that issue comes up a lot of different places, and doesn't ever really lead to anything significant.
Right. Well, and I apologize because I misspoke earlier. I said Chattooga and it meant Chattanooga. But it's interesting too because there's of the 6 U.S. Supreme Court cases that are pending right now related to water, 2 of them are Eastern. I already mentioned the suit from Florida versus Georgia as one, but the other actually deals with Tennessee. And that's the first ever groundwater case that I know you've talked, I think, with Michael Campana about before.
Right.
But that's dealing really with the city of Memphis's water supply and the aquifer in that area and the impact between Tennessee and Mississippi over groundwater. And that's an area that I think is actually really interesting and growing set of concerns. So what caught my attention actually again in the East Coast was the whisper of a potential dispute between, I believe, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio over groundwater in that area. I was like, wow, okay, we're starting to see more reliance and dependence on groundwater, and that affecting the state, sort of state security and water, if you will.
Well, we've also, in the podcast covered, actually our first podcast, a little bit of the issue had to do with transboundary aquifers between Texas and Mexico, which are, a whole new area of emerging interest. And, I look at Mississippi and Tennessee, and there's some really fascinating questions there. But nothing has really happened with that case yet, has it? I mean, there is a special master, but I don't think special master has made a ruling yet.
No, I haven't seen anything on that. Yeah, and it's not just a U.S. and it's not just a U.S. and it's either Mexico or Canadian question. This is a global question. So one of the joys of teaching something like water law, we actually have a fair number of international students who are here at Penn State Law. And so last fall when I was teaching water law, I gave my students the assignment of you need to write a paper on a legal question associated with water. I don't care where in the world it is. And so one of my students who is from Pakistan basically looked at groundwater allocation between India and Pakistan in the Indus River Basin. And she came back and basically said, look, there may be a surface water agreement on how to allocate water between these 2 areas. There is no groundwater allocation. And yet this is, the second most impacted groundwater basin in the world with a huge number of people living in that area and heavily dependent on groundwater. And so you have quickly declining groundwater levels, a high level of potential conflict, and no guidance.
So recently I saw that the number thus far of transboundary aquifers that have been mapped is 600 internationally, and I guess that number is moving upwards. So this is a good point to pivot to your Fulbright research, and by the way, congratulations again on receiving the Fulbright scholarship. Can you tell us what you're going to be doing and where you're going to be doing? But could you start off with, just telling us what that process is like? Because I often hear about Fulbright scholarships, and I don't really know the details of how that program works and how the individuals are selected.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I'm super excited about it. We're going to be in Sweden. We, my husband and then 2 kids, one of whom just turned 12 yesterday, and then my daughter who's about to turn 9, in Sweden, living in Stockholm for the next academic year, basically from August 2019 to around June-ish or so 2020. And the idea of applying for a Fulbright actually came up. My husband was eligible for a sabbatical. I'm a fixed-term faculty member here at Penn State, so I'm not necessarily eligible for a sabbatical, but I've done so much work in the United States with water and dispute resolution, conflict management, and I really, this is an area that I'm interested in and passionate about. But when I actually was an exchange student in Finland in high school and happened to actually And I've been fascinated ever since. And tracking what's been happening in Stockholm and in Sweden in general on water issues. So when we as a family were talking about, well, where could we go globally, kind of anywhere in the world that would match both my interests but also my husband's interests for time abroad, we came up with Sweden in general because there's so much work going on with water in that area for me and population and demography for him. And so I applied for the Fulbright after talking with a number of people and thinking, all right, this is a long shot, but let's put together a proposal. And so the proposal that I put together is really focused on water security, thinking about both water quantity but also water quality. So someone like Aaron Wolf, who's at Oregon State, says, while the rhetoric of water scarcity is that it's going to lead to war, when you actually look at it in more real-world practices, it's actually led to cooperation.
Right.
The rhetoric may be saber-rattling, but the actual practice is that scarcity for quality or quantity purposes tends to bring people together. So I really wanted to better understand how that was playing out, particularly as we're seeing climate change impacts around the world. What can we do for better stakeholder engagement? I was privileged to attend World Water Week in Stockholm last August, and a lot of people were like, well, we should be engaging with stakeholders. Like, okay, great. Nobody has a magic wand that basically says, okay, stakeholders, we're engaged. It can be a long, careful process to think about who should be involved in a discussion. How do you bring people together, and how do you do it carefully and methodically to not make a problem worse? And so, again, what I've loved about the work that I've been privileged to do and the people I've been privileged to work with is the creative points where people are like, aha, what about this, or what about that? To allow people to better, A, understand the real challenges they're dealing with, but B, find and implement real solutions. And so the Fulbright is really focused on what's happening in other parts of the world. I'm actually going to be partnered with the University of Uppsala, just about 70 kilometers north of Stockholm. They have a Peace and Conflict Studies program. And my counterpart there is Ashok Swain, who's done a lot of work on environmental peace building, which is different from the mediation and negotiation world that I've worked in. So I'm super excited to actually get to talk with people, not only in Sweden, but also in the broader European setting, but global setting, to deal with really very critical water questions that are playing out all across the world.
Oh, that sounds great. And I don't know if you are aware of the podcast we did last month was with Lena Salome, who is in Paris, and she was a UNESCO water mediator for 17 years, among a bunch of other things. So I've had two programs in a row where this has been part of the discussion. So how long are you going to be? Is it a full year or less?
Basically a full year. And this is something that was important to both my husband and I have been exchange students abroad. I lived in Japan and I lived in Finland, and he has lived in Italy. And so it's something we wanted to expose our kids to, something we wanted to do, a chance to take a little bit of a, sort of check out of your own life and try something else for a little bit. You had asked about the process of the Fulbright. I mean, partly it's identifying what and where. I think I learned a lot through that process, which is you need a partner institution. You need somebody to write a letter. Ideally, you probably would have gone. I visited Ashok Swain last year, but after I had applied for the Fulbright. If anyone is thinking about it, I'd recommend going before you apply. And so for Sweden, for example, they'll take 4 Fulbright Scholars a year. It's a pretty competitive process, but it's seen as the State Department's sort of a part of their diplomatic corps, where, a chunk of the funding is from the U.S. government, or most of the funding is from the U.S. government. Some funding is put in sometimes from the local partner institution. But if you look at what Fulbright Scholars are working on, it's the marvelous list of all sorts of topics, from, deep in the scientific world to the arts and everywhere in between.
Well, I'm jealous, as you probably already figured out, that you're going to be spending a year in Sweden studying water issues like that, you're going to have to give some thought to maybe telling us what you did and coming back on the show in a year or so we can learn about that.
Sure. Yeah, and we've been actually thinking about not only for ourselves but our kids of, do we do a blog about what we're learning and what we're experiencing? How do we capture the experience actually as we go? Because they're already starting to reach out and sort of bridge ties. I mentioned earlier that the Chesapeake in some ways is not so different from the Baltic. We at Penn State have quite a number of connections with the folks in the Baltic and Finland and Sweden in particular. How do we bridge those and all get smarter, better, faster? The types of questions that we're wrestling with in any given watershed or river basin or estuary are not so different. And so what has worked, for people to either on the scientific side or on the human engagement side, these are people questions at the end of the day. And so bringing people together and learning from each other, I think, is one of the great opportunities of this kind of experience. So we have been thinking, well, how do we share that? And how do we capture what we're learning as we go?
Well, that is a great place to stop. Maybe I can figure out a way to help share some of that. I guess you're going to be sending out some notices on social media, Twitter, and all that.
Yeah, I'm active on Twitter, and that's a good place. And we're certainly working to figure out what other mechanisms might make sense. So if any listeners have ideas, I'm certainly open to that as well. You
want to give everybody your Twitter handle so they can follow you?
Sure. It is at Fowler, FOWLER_Lara. I think there's not so many people who are named Lara Fowler and tweeting regularly about water and conflict dispute resolution questions. So.
Great. Well, Lara, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your time to be part of Talk+Water. This is one of the first episodes where I didn't have a barking dog outside my window or somebody mowing their lawn or the equipment malfunctioning during the middle of the broadcast. So hopefully that's the trend from now on, that I've mastered the technology with this interview, and future interviews will go just as smoothly.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and for your interest in all of these areas. And we've got to all figure this out better together.
I agree. So this has been Talk+Water podcast number 7. My guest today was Lara Fowler, who is a professor at Penn State University. I will have someone else talking about water in a month from now. I hope you will check back on iTunes or through Texas, or just by Googling Texas+Water or Talk+Water to find the podcast. Thanks again for joining us. My name's Todd Votteler. We'll talk soon.